Good evening, friends. Welcome back to Stories with Pastor Macy and Wesley. We have a special guest appearance by Wesley's Grammy Pammy tonight. We have our 18th story to read. I was looking at our stack of books that we have read versus our stack of books we have left to read, and it's getting close to Christmas, isn't it? Let's unwrap our 18th story and see what we're reading. Are you going to help, Wes? Yeah? Nope. Too much excitement. All right. Oh, this is a good one. This is James Herriot's Treasury for Children. And there are a lot of stories in here, but the specific one that is a Christmas story is called The Christmas Day Kitten. So let's find that story and start reading. Here we go. All right. Where does it start? The Christmas Day Kitten. Illustrations by Ruth Brown. Christmas can never go by without my remembering a certain little cat. I first saw her when I called to see one of Mrs. Pickering's much-loved basset hounds. I looked in some surprise at the furry creature moving quietly down the hall. "I didn't know you had a cat," I said to Mrs. Pickering, who was a plumpish, pleasant-faced woman. Mrs. Pickering smiled. "I haven't really," she said. "Debbie is a stray. She comes here 2 or 3 times a week and we give her some food. I don't know where she lives." "Do you ever get the feeling that she wants to stay with you?" I asked. "No," Mrs. Pickering shook her head. "She's a timid little thing. Just creeps in, has some food, then slips away. She doesn't seem to want to let me help her in any way." I looked at the little tabby cat again. "But she isn't just having food today," I said. "It's a funny thing. Every now and then she pops through into the sitting room and sits by the fire for a few minutes. It's as though she is giving herself a treat." The little cat was sitting up very upright on the thick rug which lay in front of the fireplace, in which the coals glowed and flamed. The 3 basset hounds were already lying there, but they seemed to curl up or wash herself or do anything other than gaze intently ahead. This was obviously a special event in her life, a treat. Then suddenly she turned and crept from the room without a sound and was gone. "That's just the way with Debbie," said Mrs. Pickering. "She never stays more than 10 minutes or so. Then she's off." I often visited the Pickering home, and I always looked out for the little cat. On one occasion I spotted her nibbling daintily from a saucer at the kitchen door. As I watched, she turned and almost floated on light footsteps to the hall and through into the sitting room. Debbie settled herself in the middle of the pile of basset hounds in her usual way, upright, still, and gazing into the glowing fire. This time I tried to make friends with her, but she leaned away as I stretched out my hand. However, I talked to her softly and managed to stroke her cheek with one finger. Then it was time for her to go, and once outside the house she jumped up onto the stone wall and down the other side. The last I saw of the little tabby was her figure flitting away across the grassy field. "I wonder where she goes," I murmured. "That's something we've never been able to find out," said Mrs. Pickering. It was 3 months later that I next heard from Mrs. Pickering. It happened to be Christmas morning. "I'm sorry to bother you on today of all days," says Mrs. Pickering apologetically. "Don't worry at all," I said. "Which of the dogs needs attention?" "It's not the dogs," she said. "It's Debbie. She's come to the house and there's something very wrong. Please come quickly." I drove through the empty market square. The snow was thick on the road and the roofs of the surrounding houses. The shops were closed, but the pretty lights of the Christmas trees winked in the windows. Mrs. Pickering's house was beautifully decorated with tinsel and holly, and the smell of turkey and sage and onion wafted from the kitchen. She had a worried look on her face as she led me through to the sitting room. Debbie was there, but she wasn't sitting upright in her usual position. She was lying quite still. Huddled close to her lay one tiny kitten. I looked down in amazement. What have we got here? It's the strangest thing, Mrs. Pickering replied. I haven't seen her for several weeks, and then she came about 2 hours ago, staggered into the kitchen, and she was carrying the kitten in her mouth. She brought it in here and laid it on the rug. Almost immediately I could see she wasn't well. Then she lay down, and she hasn't moved since. I knelt on the rug and passed my hand over Debbie's body, which Mrs. Pickering had placed onto a piece of sheet. She was very thin, and her coat was dirty. I knew she didn't have long to live. Is she ill, Mr. Harriet? Yes, I'm afraid so, but I don't think she's in pain. Mrs. Pickering looked at me and I saw there were tears in her eyes. She knelt beside Debbie and stroked the cat's head while the tears fell on the kitty's fur. Oh, the poor little thing. I should have done more for her, she said. I spoke gently. Nobody could have done more than you. Nobody could have been kinder. And she's brought her kitten to you, hasn't she? Yes, you're right, she has. Mrs. Pickering reached out and lifted the tiny, bedraggled kitten. Isn't it strange? Debbie knew she was dying, so she brought her kitten here. And on Christmas Day. I bent down and put my hand on Debbie's heart. There was no beat. I'm afraid she's died. I lifted the light body and wrapped it and took it to the car. When I came back, Mrs. Pickering was still stroking the kitten. The tears had dried and she was bright-eyed as she looked at me. I've never had a cat before, she said. I smiled. Well, it looks like you've got one now. And she certainly had. The kitten grew rapidly into a sleek, handsome, and bouncy tabby, and Mrs. Pickering called him Buster. He wasn't timid like his mother, and he lived like a king, and with the ornate collar he always wore, he looked like one too. I watched him grow up with delight, but the occasion that always stays in my mind was the following Christmas, a year after his arrival. On my way home from visiting a farmer with a sick cow, I was looking forward to my Christmas dinner. Mrs. Pickering was at her door when I passed her house, and I heard her call out, "Merry Christmas, Mr. Harriet. Come and have a drink to warm you up." I had a little time to spare, so I stopped and went in. In the house there was the festive cheer of last year and the same glorious whiff of sage and onion, but this year there was no sorrow, only Buster. He was darting up to each of the basset hounds in turn, ears pricked, eyes twinkling, dabbing a paw at them, and then streaking away. Buster does love to tease them so. He gives them no peace, said Mrs. Pickering. She was right. For a long time the dogs had led a rather sedate life, gentle walks with their mistress, plenty of good food, long snoring sessions on the rugs and armchairs. Then Buster arrived. He was now dancing up to the youngest dog again, head to one side, asking him to play. When he started boxing with both paws, it was too much for the basset, who rolled over with the cat in a wrestling game. "Come into the garden," said Mrs. Pickering. "I want to show you something." She picked up a rubber ball from the sideboard, and we went outside. She threw the ball across the lawn, and Buster bounded after it across the frosty grass, his tabby coat gleaming in the sun. He seized the ball in his mouth, brought it back to his mistress's feet, and waited. Mrs. Pickering threw it again, and Buster brought it back once more. I gasped, "A retriever cat!" The bassets looked on unimpressed. Nothing would ever make them chase a ball, but Buster did it again and again, as though he would never tire. Mrs. Pickering turned to me. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" "No," I replied. "A most remarkable cat." We went back into the house while she held Buster and laughed as the big cat purred loudly. Looking at him so healthy and content, I remembered his mother, who had carried her tiny kitten to the only place of comfort and warmth that she ever had known. Mrs. Pickering was thinking the same thing, because she turned to me, and although she was smiling, her eyes were thoughtful. "Debbie would be pleased," she said. I nodded. She would, wouldn't she? It was a year ago today that she brought him in. That's right. She hugged Buster. The best Christmas present I've ever had. The end. You know, when I think of the best Christmas present that we've ever gotten, we as a church, as humanity, of course, we think about Jesus. A baby who was brought into the world in not a dissimilar manner to Buster, in a place where no one wanted and there was dirt and grime, but God the Father knew what he was doing when he gave us the gift of Jesus, didn't he? I hope you enjoyed James Herriot's A Christmas Kitten, and we will see you again tomorrow for another story. Have a wonderful evening.